some have made the argument that this parable was original to Matthew because it doesn't exist, it doesn't have a parallel in the canon, but Matthew consistently used a lot of creativity in the places where he did overlap with the other Gospels. However, it does have a parallel in the Gospel of Thomas, which does come from a very different tradition, a more oral tradition of Jesus, and is likely written much earlier than Matthew, so it's not really possible for Matthew to have written it. I think the core of the comparison is that they both are relating a parable that we can trace back to Jesus' original teachings. But a little bit of redaction is needed, or we need to take out a level of redaction to kind of recreate what might be Jesus' original teachings. The main point that I make, and you'll notice I talk about the parable of the wheat and the darnel, not just the wheat and the weeds, is because darnel was a weed specifically that looked like wheat until the harvest. So when I reconstructed it, I came up with this. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like someone who sowed good seed. His enemies sowed darnel among the wheat. When the plants bore grain and the servants saw the darnel, they said to the sower, 'Do you want us to gather the weeds?' He refused, saying, 'No, for in gathering the darnel you would uproot the wheat as well. Wait until harvest, when the darnel will be apparent. Then they will gather the weeds and burn them.'" So now that we have the text that we're actually going to work with, we have to look at that deep structure analysis that Paul Michel talks about. And there are several aspects of the socio-historical context of Jesus, as well as the political context, that could be important for us to understand. The first is the literary context. Jesus taught in his parables about the kingdom of God, and like we talked about, it is metaphoric language, so that is a big clue as to which model is appropriate. But we also have these three overlapping elements. There is spirituality, which has the enemy in it. The enemy can be the spiritual enemy of the devil, but it can also be the enemy of the Roman authorities. In Matthew's time, it was often identified the enemy was other Jewish groups who did not believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And then you also have this overlapping language of the harvest and the agricultural knowledge that Jesus' audience would have had. So since the language overlaps in so many different areas with the text of the parable, I use metaphor. And one of the reasons I also use metaphor is because the parable borrows from the Old Testament in its symbolic structure. So this is a really interesting symbolic structure because people are two different things at the same time. They're plants and they're also servants. And my argument, the servants here are human leaders. You know, Jesus said if you want to lead, you got to serve. But in our context of a secular democracy, this isn't an elite group anymore. All citizens of a secular democracy have an obligation to be part of social decision making. So then all people in that society become these servants, as well as the plants over here that represent the field of the world. So what happens when you think about this parable? John Dominic Crossan would call it a parable of reversal because of the shock value that comes out of it. If you've ever gardened at all, if you leave the weeds, which I did one year actually, it will grow over everything and you won't have a harvest at all. So people are, of course, saying, "Are you crazy? You have to pull the weeds." And Jesus said, absolutely not. If you pull the weeds, then you will actually have the same result as if you didn't pull the weeds in actual reality. In the kingdom of God, it's absolutely the opposite. So then it starts people thinking, how could this be possible? And Jerome Neri talks about the ancient value system of honor, that Jesus consistently teaches a different model for honor than the one that was prevalent in society and could be applied to this parable as well. And this is something we're very familiar with in our society, right? Our security comes with our ability to defend our resources and our interests in the world. And that is how we can have honor in our community. Jesus teaches the opposite. If you have security, that God is going to take care of those resources, and God has access to unlimited resources, then it is God's honor that ends up being served instead of human honor. And that is the point of the kingdom. So, the main point of the parable overall is that, oops, I got these out of order. Evil cannot damage good after all. The Darnel can't damage the wheat. It's actually the servants who think that they're doing a good thing for the harvest who can actually harm the harvest, according to this parable, which is very different than the Matthean interpretation, which argues for the violent ending. So this metaphor and this interpretation can have a variety of applications in individual and social contexts. I apply it to state-sponsored violence. The way I apply it to state-sponsored violence is that if people identify and remove the wrong enemies, then what they're doing is violently plucking people from the field of the world. One example is capital punishment that we used in the beginning. We identify the enemies of society, people who have committed a certain type of crimes. And this interpretation says that if you do that and then you kill them, you will necessarily kill innocent people. You will damage the harvest. So this helps us create, it's not an outline for policy, but it helps us create that model that we can use to talk about state-sponsored violence in the larger sphere. Jesus is not advocating not doing anything. Jesus doesn't say there are no enemies. In fact, Jesus says there are legitimate and real enemies that we have to resist. But you can't resist using violence and expect to really get the culmination of the kingdom of heaven. So I would argue that Jesus is advocating for patience and nonviolence in resistance to evil through this parable. And the way we can take this then from its Christian context and try to articulate this to the broader social or secular democracy is to talk about that concept of the enemy. And we have to share a common enemy. And this parable really talks about not creating enemies where you're marginalizing parts of society. Because it's the people who are the most vulnerable who are going to end up in the bottom of the pot and being incorrectly misidentified, like the case of capital punishment. So if poverty, marginalization, exclusion in our society is our common enemy, then the opposite of that, and what we need to pursue as a society, is social inclusion. So my argument is that active societal improvements in these areas of social inclusion, the labor market, educational outcomes, health inequality, housing, neighborhoods, and the only thing that we as a country measure, which is income inequality, that is the poverty level, is your income. But all of these areas really need to be considered to create a society that doesn't marginalize the wrong enemies. And that is the whole case study all the way through. But again, this is just one of many interpretations. And at this point, I would open it up for evaluation by the Christian community and the secular democratic society to check me.
Thank you.